On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Lauran Star. She is an expert within the diversity, equity, inclusion space. We're going to be talking to her about building virtual inclusion within the workplace. She does a lot of work in the STEM and healthcare industry. I'm super excited to have you on and talk about this. I think a lot of people will benefit.
I am thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me. Great topic.
Absolutely. Thank you. I guess let's start at the top. Let's have everybody know who you are and kind of what your expertise lies, and we'll dive in from there.
Sure. I am a workplace inclusion, diversity, and equity psychologist. Now, that doesn't mean that I have a couch in my office. What it means is that I look at the organization as a whole and plug in diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I space those out because they're three very different things with very different outcomes. So I really focus on the organizational culture to drive that diversity in the workplace. I work in healthcare and STEM predominantly. I've been doing this for about 20 years. I started my inclusion journey, well before it was cool. And I will share that my inclusion journey actually started with Uncle Sam, the United States Armed Services. I was in the Army for 10 years, and I learned forced inclusion within the military. So, yeah, and that kind of brings it all up to speed now.
Awesome. And thank you for your service. I saw that you were I remember seeing on your LinkedIn that you're a trauma medic. So that has got to be one heck of a role to fill. I'm sure that's a whole different story. So
yeah, it is.
We'll have to maybe have you back and kind of give us some insights in terms of the transition to the workplace. But
sure.
So I guess this episode we're talking about virtual inclusion and how you build that. I know we actually talked about the concept of DE&I beforehand, and I think we were talking about how we could be more tactical with some of the discussion and not some of the theoretical stuff. And there are two components. There is I guess you got to separate out the DE&I out, because you have to understand how the inclusivity works there. And then also, if you're actually trying to, with intent, build inclusion, especially in a workplace, that's a whole different focus. I guess let's start with the DE&I piece. And I guess when we talk about that and when we hear diversity alone doesn't work, I mean, what does that actually mean?
Diversity's become a dirty word. We've been doing diversity in the workplace for 60 years. And it amazes me when I meet in the C-suite or senior VPs and I'll say, what do you think about diversity? And they're like, quota attainment. I'm like, no, that's affirmative action. That's not diversity. So, right, if your organization is putting out that we want X percentage of women in leadership or people of color or disabilities or veterans, that's affirmative action. That's not diversity. Diversity, right, to level set it, the value of diversity is different. The different perspectives and thoughts your employees bring to the table. That's it. That's the value of diversity. Right now, yes, it does drive innovation. However, if you don't have an inclusive workplace, and we're seeing this more now than ever, in part because of COVID, in part because hybrid and remote work, the virtual world is here. I mean, it's been with us, let's be honest, it's been with us for the last 15 years, but now we're forced to jump in. If you don't have the foundation of inclusion, and simply put, inclusion is creating an organizational culture where you feel, your employees feel, they're seen, they're heard, they can share their ideas openly, then no matter how much diversity you have, if there's no inclusion, you've got nothing. You have zero benefits. So, yeah, so that kind of level sets it.
Yeah, go back. I want you actually maybe, there's a specific, question I have, and I'm curious because I hear this all the time. We do a lot of work for technology recruiting. I hear diversity constantly. What I hear, the feedback I get is a non-Caucasian male, right? That is what we consider. That's when we get approached by a client, they're like, we want diverse. They're like, bring us candidates that is not this person. I hear that and I go, is that really what your goal of diversity? Because now after I heard you mention affirmative action, I'm like, are we confusing what the goal of this process is.
And not only that, we're not only confusing what diversity is, but you're creating a discrimination lawsuit with that one statement. See, because you can't, yes, white males were in the workplace first. Now we see women and male ratios are starting to level out. But for a company to come out and say, we want diverse candidates, that means non-white male employees. That's discrimination, point blank. And you're setting yourself up for failure because the goal of diversity is diverse perspective of thought. Let me put it this way for my sports fans out there that are tuning in here. Do you think the Patriots, I'm from New England, go ahead, you can email me. All right, do you think the Patriots, when looking for a wide receiver, put out, hey, let's make sure whomever we bring on is diverse? No. What are they saying? Bring on the best dang wide receiver we can possibly find because we want to go to the Super Bowl. Why aren't organizations doing that same thing? We should be looking for the best of the best, the top of the talent pool, first and foremost. And yes, I get it. We absolutely want diversity in the workforce. I'm not saying poo-poo to diversity. We want diversity in the workforce, but we want to make sure that, we're getting top talent first and that the organizational culture is going to support that diverse candidate. So imagine in technology, you're a person of color, female person of color, perfect. And you get hired by this technology company. You are the diversity hire, right? Recruited in, and you get there and no one listens to you. In fact, no one could really care less about your ideas. The minute you step your foot on the floor, it's like, or in the virtual space, there's our diversity hire. We got a woman and she's a person of color. That's 2 boxes checked. Because trust me, your employees are smart. They're not going to listen to her. Well, what does she do? She'll stay for 2 years, take the best of what you've got, and then she'll go find a company that's going to value her.
So there's 2 questions that'll come from that for me. One is, you deal with a lot of STEM. Yes, we are getting more non-males going into STEM programs. There's a long lead time. I mean, we got to go through an educational generation. We need more non-males going into engineering schools, scientific degrees, coming out with the desire. There's a long lead time to find that to come to fruition, to go, okay, there's just more candidates leveling up and all that. So when you see that, and obviously, when you're looking at companies who are thinking about diversity, is the perspective of going diverse wrong in the sense that we're just looking for somebody that's a different gender or different, different like a different attribute that's a physical distinguishing component of who they are, versus it might be that somebody's coming to the table that's diverse, and you just said diversity of thought, which all of a sudden opens up your company to different ideas that maybe before, even with the goal of diversity, is still not being as open as you think.
Now, the goal of that diversity is different perspectives, and that comes from our lived experiences, and that helps us understand our clients, our end users. That's the goal of diversity. But you're right, we're not looking at, what is it, 23% of women are in STEM now, or the STEM employee base is 23% women. Okay, well, that makes sense, because guess what? In colleges, it's about 23% for enrollment. Now, I take a step back and I go, okay, so, as a mom of twin girls, now my son is a sophomore, he's a mechatronic engineer, and my twin girls are going to college next year. One of them is going chemical engineering, right? And they're not going in it to be diverse. Right? My daughter just loves it. Like, it's her language. She gets it. You're going to have to wait 4 years to get your hands on her. And here's the difference in thought, right? She doesn't see chemical engineering as just plastics. She sees chemical engineering as tissue advancement, as, fuel, as, the chemical engineering is much from her lens. She's going to make an impact based on her life, right? Her perceived life experience. So that's what we're looking for. But if we don't have the numbers, we can't demand that. It's like coming up into New Hampshire and saying, we want diverse engineers. Well, diversity in New Hampshire is, do you own a gun? And what flannel do you wear? That's diversity up here. It's a pretty white state. And we don't have the social structure that supports it, which is why this virtual now allows us to reach outside of New Hampshire. But again, if the company isn't inclusive, if they're not going to support that diverse candidate, then the diverse candidate's going to leave. And Amir, I have to ask this, why is it just gender that we consider diversity? I have 3 disabilities. I'm a veteran. I am more than a woman going into STEM. My lived experience is pretty dynamic and extremely diverse from everybody else, just as your background is very diverse from mine, right? We're already fairly diverse in full spectrum. Everybody's unique. Everybody has a different lived experience and a different perspective. Now we're saying, okay, let's look at those protected classes and make sure that we are diversifying the workforce because our end users are becoming more and more diverse. Our end users are now veterans. Do you have veterans? Is there an initiative to pull veterans in? What about disabilities? Right? Is there an initiative in your organization that's looking at those with disabilities? Because your end users have disabilities. Right? There's a huge campaign right now about IT accessibility. And if you're not hiring individuals that have a disability, you're missing the boat because you're not going to understand that lived experience. So it's not just gender.
Well, let me ask you this. I agree. I mean, I think every background brings a different viewpoint. And when you're looking at inclusivity, and maybe, you obviously mentioned diversity of thought. So I think everyone understands why you need the diversity piece, that diversity of thought. When it comes to inclusivity, and let's just take you and I, for example. We have 2 different backgrounds. I have a very diverse background. I'm a technologist who owns a recruiting company. It's not very common. You're a military veteran within the D&I space with a ton of experience and a PhD as an expert. So you have a different back. If we were to collaborate on a project together, there would be this. I know this whole storming, norming, conforming dynamic that exists with people work together, but there's this ability, if somebody was to put us together, to be able to make sure that that we can express thoughts, we can be vulnerable with thoughts, we can kind of share ideas, not worry about judgment. And when I hear inclusivity, to me, it's such a complicated thing. I mean, we're going to, I think, get into the virtual component next, but before we get there, when we're talking about inclusivity, what has to happen? Like, what are we trying to nurture? What conversations are we trying to allow to happen so that people can feel inclusive?
Yeah, I think, and I take this lesson from the Army. Right, I didn't get to pick who my battle buddy was. They just paired me up with someone, and sometimes that battle buddy would change on the dime, depending on where I was. South America, the Gulf, didn't matter, right? It would change up, and they didn't say, "Okay, now you've got a week to form, storm, and norm." No, you are from the get-go. So that's why it's really important that we have, knowledge and skills first and foremost, quality first and foremost. Because I know jumping out of that plane, my battle buddy, whomever that person is, whatever their gender is, their language, their ethnicity, doesn't matter. Their experience, we both have the same high quality in jumping out of that plane. And then from there, we're quickly, but because we both have that same high quality, we're able to quickly see strengths and holes, right? Such as, right, when I'm paired up with a male, I am never going to have the same upper body strength. Now, I have never had to ask my battle buddy to carry something for me. They just did it intuitively. There was no judgment. I got a 275-pound guy having a heart attack. I'm stronger on the CPR than he is. I didn't have to lift the stretcher. Magically, 5 guys appeared and lifted the stretcher and put him in my wagon. It's right. That's inclusion. That's going, okay, like there's our medic, but we've got to lift the stretcher so she can save his life. It's playing to our strengths. And that's the same in the workplace. And you would think it's complicated, but it really isn't. It's getting to know, and we, in the workplace, we get time to figure out who each other are. One thing in the military, where I know where my gaps are, I'm like, hey, you know what? I'm not detail focused. I'm your medic. Don't give me a map. I am medical hardcore. I can figure out all those calculations in my brain. These are my strengths. These are my weaknesses or areas for development, whatever you want to call them. And the person next to me, my battle buddy, would be like, okay, my strengths are these are my weaknesses. Okay. All of a sudden, now we both have an inventory of skills that's double what we had to start with.
Do you think that's easier, I guess, in the military because
it's forced?
It's forced, but also everyone comes in at a, well, not everyone, most people come in at a certain level and people are given skills along the way. And there's a certain, I guess, process that will get you a certain point. And it's, you'd hope it's merit-based, that if you're not proficient, you're not just advanced, but the process is so defined and so rigid and it's so understood that there's a little bit of comfort knowing that the person to the left of you has X skill, they're good at this, and there's that built-in forced inclusivity that they foster versus a private, organization or a public organization where you just don't know where the person's background is. You're assuming that the hiring committee or the team made all the right decisions, but yeah, hey, this person next to you, well, now virtually, you got to trust them to be able to deliver, execute. So it's a little bit different, I guess. And I guess when you look at some of what you're saying, I'm kind of listening to it going, some of, I guess, maybe the challenges around feeling comfortable around inclusion could be, the team you're on, there's other attributes of why you don't feel as close. Not that it's forced or not, but there's you don't know the other person as well. And especially virtually, we barely get to meet anybody. We get a few minutes and we're basically asked to go do the job with that person.
I think this is where inclusion kind of falls short in the workplace. And I hear what you're saying, right? We're all expected to have the same skill level, but let's be honest, right? During basic training, I learned how to work a radio and I learned how to call in a medevac. You never want me on the radio or the medevac. It is not like I'm afraid of it. Right. I'm afraid of, and it's just a stupid little box, but it's a life-saving box. I'm afraid of that. And anyone that I've ever been partnered up with knows that you don't want her on the mic. It just doesn't work. Okay. I can read an EKG with my eyes closed, but yet other medics can't. Right? They didn't pay attention there. So it's just like going to college, right? When we go to college, when we come out and engineer, your engineers are expected to have a certain skill level, but it doesn't mean they're phenomenal in every bucket. Those are your strengths. The difference between the military and the workplace, in the military, we talk about it. In the workplace, we're afraid to share where our weaknesses are. So one of the things I love doing, and even with the company that I'm working with right now, when we have our virtual team meetings, we always have an icebreaker. Every flippin' team meeting, there's an icebreaker, and it's unique. And we all take turns doing that icebreaker. Some of them are fun, and some of them are very skills based. If there's one skill you'd like to improve, what is it? Now you know who's really good at what, right? If there's one skill you don't have to improve, what is it? Like, what is the skill that you're most proud of in the job function? You just did what we do in the military, right? Boots on ground. What are you good at? Where do you Where are you going to be challenged? This is where I'm good. This is where I'm going to be challenged. And then you're problem solving in that moment. And you'll see in the virtual, I watch people write, like taking notes on an icebreaker. Like what we're doing is we're building a competency list. And who's got that competency?
Do you want the manager there? Like, I guess in that case where, obviously, every meeting has a, icebreaker. And again, it could be that the meeting is to actually get to know your team, because obviously we're all remote in many cases, not all cases. But do you sometimes want the manager not there, or the person who's in charge, to allow people to be a little bit more comfortable in feeling vulnerable with other colleagues? Is that what you want, or you're like, hey, listen, you have to work with your manager?
You have to work with your manager. You have to work with your manager. You have to work with your leader. They have to be part of your team, and they need to know what you're sharing, right? Because if I'm a manager, I want to know where my people need to develop. I also have to be vulnerable, though. So my years as a manager, and we would have phone calls instead of virtual. I was in sales, and we'd have phone calls, right? The monthly or the weekly Monday morning, 9 a.m. conference call. Where are my weaknesses? I'm horrible at details, the finer details. So I've decided that I'm going to make doing the expense reports a developmental activity. Who wants to do it? And now, not only am I developing my employees, but I'm being vulnerable, letting them know that I too have weaknesses. I too have areas I need to work on. And now I'm part of something bigger. Not only am I leading this team, but I'm included in the team.
Do you have to, I guess, when you're running these meetings and you're trying to build this sense of inclusivity, typically, I guess, the manager becomes the main facilitator and everyone answers the questions. I mean, is that a part of allowing for that inclusivity? Is that the way we should be doing it? Or,
What? You should be rotating who's facilitating the meeting. You should allow for different ideas to come up, right? I think in this virtual world right now, right? If I were to step into a management or leadership position where I have a team, the first thing I would do is actually our first meeting, have an icebreaker about who are you, right? You all have, 3 fun-filled facts, or 2 truths and a lie, whatever, just to break the ice. Then I would spend the entire meeting talking about inclusion. Like, hey, you know what? Part of my management leadership style is I want my team to be very inclusive of each other. And this is what inclusion means to me and the organization. And these are the benefits to the organization, to myself. What do you think the benefits of inclusion are to you? And then you pose that question, how do we build inclusion? How do we tackle this? I want everybody's buy-in on this.
And I guess I kind of, if I'm assuming, and correct me, but I'm thinking if I have a new employee, this is a great way of getting them involved. It's a good way of talking so they can hear everybody else. Is this something we're doing just on new hire? Because I guess we're talking, to take a step back, we're talking about, virtual workplace inclusivity. Obviously, if your team feels inclusive, it kind of grows out. You want to foster that, as having multiple teams feel inclusive, and we could maybe talk about how that happens. But like you're talking about, hey, let's have the icebreaker, rotating facilitators, do this assessment. Is this a once in a while thing on a new hire basis? Like, what's the frequency of? We don't want to do this every meeting, I'm assuming.
Right, you should be doing this. Right. Again, inclusion is a journey, and we're constantly moving forward. And say I'm taking over a team. I'm the new hire, or I'm a sitting manager. I am one of the managers in IT right now going, this is really interesting. You can do this at your next call. Guys, I want to reset for 2023, and I want us to be inclusive. Right, well before we're diverse. I want us to be inclusive. I want us to function as a team. Inclusion means that everybody should feel comfortable here to share their voice. Everybody here should be able to show up to work as they are, as a person. That does not mean show up without a shirt on, right? Show up professionally. Well, you got to be careful. You never know. I want us to rely on each other. And by doing this, here's what it means. It means that if we have an inclusive team, we're going to be a lot more productive. We're going to be much happier in our job because we're going to be connected. It can be so lonely in a virtual environment. So, that's the prong of that inclusion, is now we're creating that sense of belonging to your team and the organization.
If you were to go back and think about the organization, and obviously the goal of the organization, let's say it's a software company, they want inclusivity. And at one level, there's organizational inclusivity. Obviously, we're all working for the same company, getting the paycheck and showing up at the job kind of has a common ground, but obviously it's difficult because all these different levels, you have people in marketing, people in finance, the software engineering team, management team. It seems very challenging to find the commonality there. I'm sure it's doable. That's where employer brand comes in, all that kind of stuff, employee experience. But then what I'm hearing is like, yes, there's also, you have to get a little bit more granular. You got to get to the boots on the ground, build more micro inclusivity so that people at that intimate level can get to know each other. Because it is hard if you're working for a 500, 1,000 person company. Inclusivity at the organizational level, to me, seems like it's way more employer brand understanding, awareness, versus inclusivity trickles all the way down to the team and who I work with. Because if I feel inclusive there, obviously, multiple teams feeling inclusive, then there's a greater sense of that brand.
So inclusion has to come from the top.
Okay.
First and foremost, inclusion's got to come from the C-suite, and your C-suite they have to believe it. They have to live it, right? They have to want it. They have to understand the business benefit. And if you're focusing in on diversity, you're going to miss the boat. All you're going to do is create that revolving door in hiring practices, right? You focus in on inclusion and building up that culture and then trickle it down. But the beautiful point about inclusion is that inclusion is driven by one person at a time. So while leadership has to lead it, it's your granular boots on the ground employees that drive it.
I think that's great. And I think, I hear a lot of times founders of startups talk about how early on they know everybody on the team. They're involved. They're in the so-called trenches. They know the first 20 hires, 30 hires, and then you follow up with them and they hit 150, 200 people, and they say, "Well, I feel disconnected from the company. I know my managers. I have that management layer." But yet, obviously, they have a passion for that company that's as great as anybody else. It's their name's on the paperwork, right? I mean, how could they not? If you're looking at that and you're like, okay, you're a startup, you're growing, you're hyper growth, you're going to 3, 4, 5x headcount very quickly. If you're a founder, knowing that you're going to have that disconnect, that distance is going to increase between every single employee, what fundamentals do you put in place so that even though you might not know everybody's names, you still have that same sense of your inclusivity in the company, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I've worked with some phenomenal CEOs that, as their companies are growing, they still do the surprise pop into a manager's meeting, especially in the virtual environment or the leadership meeting. They become part of the advancing inclusion by creating, a DE&I committee or council that oversees the culture. I like to call it a culture committee instead of DE&I because we're traumatized with the word diversity. Right? I know some of you every time I say it, you roll your eyes. I can feel it. And I understand that, right? Because we've really polarized it. But yeah, these are CEOs that, are now part of their culture committee. So they're still having those touch points. They're building up employee resource groups where affinities can come together with their allies and openly and safely discuss the problems that they're facing. And you've got a funnel of communication that goes up to your culture committee to discuss so that we can address it, so we hear you. I think one of the most frustrating things as the company grows your employees, the older employees, not so much the newer employees, but your older employees start feeling like, or tenured employees start feeling like they're no longer being heard. And the easiest way to do that, right, is to, reach out and have these employee resource groups set up mentoring with the older employee, right? Your more tenured employees, have them mentor your new hires coming on board, even in the virtual environment, and have those discussions. Right. And that you can do that through, OD&L, organizational development learning. You've got a mentorship program. You've got one touch point as the CEO. You've got a touch point. You can touch that person and say, what are we hearing? What's going on? Where are they developing? Where are they struggling? And then be transparent about it. There's nothing worse than gathering all this information and then sitting on it. You have your engagement surveys, your employee engagement surveys. Should be doing those once a year. You do that engagement survey. If you're a CEO of a growing business, you really should be addressing your employees about what you're reading in your engagement survey. Otherwise, you're not going to get the truth. So, there's a lot of things that CEO in a growing business can do to remain inclusive with their employees, especially in a virtual market. Because, the computer can go anywhere we go now.
What do you say to the, when everyone's now on some kind of virtual? We're all, I guess Zoom became synonymous during the pandemic. Everyone, let's jump on a Zoom.
Virtual. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Zoom. That's we're going to do the same thing we did on a Zoom. Obviously, on a Zoom, engagement's harder to gauge. You can't tell, if people's cameras aren't on. That's a negative. You can't tell if they're looking at you, but they're actually looking at their work screen, or they're doing something else. That engagement, when you're in an office or just sitting in a conference room, you could tell. You can't pull out a phone and be swiping or whatever. So how do you, obviously there's the limitation with the tool, but how do you go about making sure that, as I'm kind of listening to this inclusivity, the engagement is very important in each and every encounter? How do you make sure people are actually engaged and aren't off doing something else, even though they're supposed to be in this meeting with some people?
That's where, right? Again, inclusion, it takes just one person. It takes one employee at a time and inclusion I see hand in hand with engagement, right? If you're an inclusive organization, you have an engaged organization. And that's what the data shows. You empower your team. And the way that you do that is, we just had our inclusive meeting. And then we discuss business. Maybe the next meeting we go, let's come up with some guidelines, right? We believe, or, when we're on this meeting together, we will be focused on this meeting only. We will keep our computers on. We will be actively engaged, either through the chat or, right? We will come up with your guidelines for how these meetings, we're going to rotate facilitators. We're going to rotate the person that does the icebreaker. We're always going to have a developmental aspect or whatever, guests. Or set up your meeting. And then from there, come up with a word. And I've seen this, the organization I'm working with right now, they're awesome at this. And they have a word, it's pickle. And if somebody on the team is not engaged, like you can tell, right? Because computers are on. So I know if you're looking around, you're not paying attention. If you're constantly looking down and looking up, you're typing. They will ping each other and just throw the word pickle out, right?
That's
on
good.
chat.
That's a good one.
Pickle. And we've seen that engagement go through the roof now. Like at first they were like private messaging each other. Now they're calling each other out right there in the team chat or the Zoom chat, just saying, hey, Lauran, pickle. Everybody knows I was just busted. But there's no hard feeling about it. There's no like, oh my God, right there. Pickle, like a pickle, it's just a word, but it's a funny word.
It's almost as like you're trying to make sure, like, we understand being at home, virtual, looking at your, TV, monitor, screen, laptop, whatever it is. trying to stay engaged is different than all of us being around a conference. There's, we lose body language. But I like this. I like the word pickle. It kind of is like, hey, listen, snap out of it. Maybe right before you think you could, you can handle, the meeting and maybe, simultaneously do something else. But pickle brings it back.
Yeah, it pulls you back. Like when somebody pings me and says pickle, I'm like, oh crap.
There you go. You caught me. It's a good reminder. It's like, hey,
it's a good, yeah.
It's not and I guess it depends if you, as an organization, I think this goes back to a lot of what you're saying is if you make that hey, we understand that you might get distracted. You're at home. We get it. Your kid might run in. It might distract you. Your wife might be, or husband or spouse might be gesturing in the corner. All those things can happen. Pickle is not that you're in trouble. We're not writing down how many pickles you got and demerit it. But hey, listen, if you hear pickle, that means you need to refocus. We don't have the best of you in the meeting, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. And it really has to be driven from the bottom up, right? So this is where your managers and leaders, because every team is unique. Every team is unique. And we don't want our teams to become siloed either. So, we talk about, pickle, you're busted, you're no longer in the headspace of the meeting. And that's why I always encourage in that right in your, this is what we're doing. These are the rules we're going to play by, right? It's always nice to invite a guest in. The last 3 minutes, the last 5 minutes, like what does finance do? Scott, what exactly do you do in finance? And it can be anybody. Oh, hey, hey, this is what I do. If you need me there. Now we're breaking down silos on top, right? All of a sudden, right, this virtual world, because we have to have intent to engage and be inclusive, that intent is like tenfold now. Right now, Scott, who normally I'd never bump into face-to-face, can join us because he's sitting at home on his computer and has free time because he's not driving into the office. So let's get that scheduled in. Pickle.
Pickle. I'm going to steal that.
I love pickle. I love pickle.
It's great. It's a great one. Let me ask you this, because I think the one question I do get from people, and it's always about understanding. Even myself, I've asked other leaders, how do you run a one-on-one better to make sure it's inclusive? Because the worst thing of the one-on-one that could happen is about the manager, talking about what that person sees. We're virtual. One-on-ones are a little bit different than they were maybe even in person because you lose that body language. If there was one thing that you'd want, like a manager, who's managing individual contributors, to be able to improve on those one-on-ones to help inclusivity, I mean, what would that one thing be?
Keeping in mind, cameras are always on in a one-on-one, always. Coaching, right? That automatically, when you're coaching someone, it's all about engagement. So managers ask more questions than telling. And Amir, we have a generation coming in, right? Your millennials, even your Gen Zs that are used to being coached to figure out the problem. If we just provide those two generations the solution, they're never going to figure out how to create a solution. And coaching it's allowing your employee that's sitting across from you that space to take risk. We know these generations, the millennials and Gen Zs aren't huge risk takers. Now I'm letting you take risk. How do you think we should solve that? Right? Or hey, you know what? Right? When we're giving feedback, like maybe I needed this report last week. I need to understand, rather than coming at that employee saying, hey, why wasn't it on my desk? I need to understand why this was late. Like, what's going on in your world so that we can better meet time requirements? We, not you, we, right? I'm part of that team. It's all around coaching. Get better at coaching. And if you don't have a coaching program in your organization, reach out to me. I've got plenty that teach coaching programs in organizations. And coaching.
I like that. I think it's and just on that note, I was going to say thank you for being on and sharing. I think a lot of these concepts are fragmented and different people have different views. I think it's really important to talk about the inclusivity piece. And the last thing you mentioned, coaching. I think managers they don't always see their job as a coach, and especially maybe younger, even early stage career managers don't see how impactful they can be. But I think that's a great observation.
That's their job. We want to coach our employees. We don't want to tell our employees. That was the transactional business days. We want to coach our employees so that they can create their own solutions. If you're a manager and you're finding that your job is problem solving, take a step back and start coaching around the problems, because that's not your job. Isn't to solve problems. That's why we hire talented individuals, especially in engineering, right? To solve problems. You've got to coach your people into how to solve a problem.
Lauran, awesome. I was going to say thank you for being on. Thank you for sharing.
This was awesome.
If somebody wants to reach out to you, I know you mentioned you know other coaches. You have resources that could for people. What's a good way of getting a hold? I mean, you mentioned a lot of stuff. I'm sure somebody might be like, "Hey, that's a great idea. Where do I start with that?" Because it's one thing to hear, the other one to start. How does somebody get in contact with you?
So you can get in contact with me simply by just going to my website, drlauranstar.com. Go right to my website. I also have a book out right now called Evidence-Based Inclusion. It's time to focus on the right needle. You can go to Amazon, order that copy right there. But everything's right there on my website. Just go to my website. Everything is there.
Okay. We'll definitely include in the show notes, obviously your website, the link to the book, because I think obviously it'd be a good read for a lot of people. But thank you for being on. Thanks for sharing. I really enjoyed the conversation with you.
This was awesome. Thanks for having me.
All right. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. If you guys do want to follow up and learn more, follow the resource links that we're going to provide. I think Lauran has a ton of wealth of information. So feel free to reach out to her. If you find the podcast useful, share it with somebody else. Give it a rating in whatever platform you're listening to. That's how we've been growing. So thank you for that. Until next time, thank you. Goodbye.